Okay, just a few seconds.
All right.
Okay, I think we are live now. Professor Charles, you may start.
All right. So let's begin our webinar. Human habitats are now primarily urban. Major challenges as climate change, the global pandemic, and biodiversity loss have placed greater emphasis on the need for greening our cities and towns. But how can connections between people and their locality, such as urban forests and city parks, be promoted at a time where urbanization seems determined to sweep away the differences between regions, cities, towns, neighborhoods, landscapes, and even social classes? I believe we may have the answer to that. City forestry and related approaches such as urban forestry and the adoption of nature-based thinking can help cities make the next step towards greater resilience, health, and livability. And we are going to learn more about it. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on what time zone you are right now, whether you are viewing via our YouTube channel, that is Environmental Landscape Studio Laboratory. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, or perhaps joining us today via Zoom. Welcome to the City and the Forest, Urban Forestry and Nature-Based Thinking as New Urban Paradigm. Our webinar today is particularly special. Apart from the regular Tuesday webinar series organized by the Environmental Landscape Studio Laboratory, this webinar is in solidarity and of celebration of the World Landscape Architecture Month. It is a month-long international celebration of landscape architect and design public and private spaces. People and communities around the world have deep, long-standing personal connections to the space we landscape architects create. It is the month of April that we demonstrate this connection by highlighting the works of landscape architects. With a staggering 126 registered participants, thank you for celebrating with us. We are very lucky today to be joined by one of the biggest names, if not the biggest name in the field of urban greening and urban forestry, Dr. Cecil Conanday. Dr. Cecil is widely regarded as a world leading expert within the field of urban forestry. For the past 25 years, he has studied, taught, and advised on the role of trees and green spaces in our cities and towns. In the early 2000s, he helped found the field's leading academic journal, Urban Forestry and Urban Greening. And he co-edited several seminal textbooks, such as the pioneering book entitled The Forest and the City, the Cultural Landscape of Urban Woodland. His particular interests include green space governance, including community involvement, people-nature relationships, urban ecosystem services, nature-based solutions, and green leadership. Dr. Cecil's work has brought him across the globe, and he has always worked in close dialogue with decision makers and practitioners, and is eager to develop new research that has high practical relevance. Before coming to the University of British Columbia, Dr. Cecil worked at Wageningen University in Netherlands, the European Forest Institute in Finland, the University of Copenhagen in Denmark, the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences in Sweden, and the University of Hong Kong. He is currently a director of the NatureBased Solutions Institute and the program director of Master of Urban Forestry at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. Without further ado, I give you our speaker for today, Dr. Cecil Conanday. Dr. Cecil, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Charles, for that very kind introduction. And thanks very much also to Professor Dan and all the colleagues at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. It's a real pleasure to be with you, with distinguished landscape architecture colleagues in this, as Charles said, really momentous month, the International Month of Landscape Architecture. And I have to tell you a secret, I'm actually not a landscape architect. I'm actually trained as a forester, but I've done a lot of landscape architecture work in my career, and I've often worked with landscape architects. So a lot of my thinking, a lot of things I'll present today will be very relevant, I think, for landscape architects, as well as for other disciplines, including forestry, urban ecology, urban planning, architecture, and also social sciences. So it is of course challenging these days. We're all in lockdowns. It's not so nice maybe to interact with the students always because we can't see each other face to face. But one of the good things, honestly, is that I've had a chance to interact in this kind of webinar form with colleagues from all over the world. And that's sometimes, of course, more difficult when we have to do this in person. So I think that could be one of the more positive aspects of it. And it's really wonderful that I have a first chance now to present to colleagues in the Philippines. And I want to talk, of course, about urban forestry, which is my field. And I really want to talk about trying to bring in a nature-based thinking paradigm. So to try to work with nature, to integrate nature in the way we design, develop, manage, and improve our cities. Of course, we know that there's a lot happening around us. So we live in a world of tremendous change. I'm sure in the Philippines, as here in Spain, in Barcelona, where I'm sitting right now, we've all faced the consequences of climate change. We've seen heating, we've seen all kinds of extreme weather events. And of course, we've also seen things like public health challenges. We've seen that many of us are facing a lot of diseases that are related to more sedentary lifestyles, living in cities. We have seen issues, of course, with things like stress. And then, of course, today we have this very direct consequence of or health issue, the COVID-19 pandemic, that is affecting everybody in the world, actually. And really has I think, made us realize the importance also of having local nature, local green space. I think for many of us, just having visual access to the trees outside of our windows, to being able to walk maybe to a smaller nearby park if we were still allowed to use it, has been crucial for keeping some kind of sanity, some kind of health during more than a year now of being in various forms of lockdown. So I think as people working with landscapes and green, we can capitalize on some of these big challenges. A challenge, of course, sounds maybe negative, but it's usually also an opportunity. So we can turn it around and actually start capitalizing on some of the things we need to change in society. So we see a reappreciation of nearby nature, as I said, during the COVID-19 pandemic. But actually, this is a process that has been ongoing for quite some time. We also see that green infrastructure in generally has been seen as a really good way of dealing with the effects of climate change in cities, adapting our cities to different climates. We see also a mainstreaming of urban nature into different policy agendas, which is something I'll get back to in a bit. And then we also see a need to find good governance and leadership approaches to dealing with our cities and dealing with the green spaces in them. When I was still in Vancouver last summer, I left or returned to Europe last summer. We were actually still allowed during the pandemic to go to our parks and nature areas. So this is Kitsilano Beach. For those of you who might know Vancouver, Stanley Park is visible there in the background. So we were really fortunate that, unlike in Barcelona, where people are really locked in completely, we're not allowed to go out, we were allowed to go to our nature areas. And of course, this really showed the immense importance of having access to nature also during a global pandemic. And together with some of my colleagues, led by a colleague called Jordi Honi-Roses, also at UBC, we tried early on to think a little bit about the impact of the COVID pandemic on open space. And of course, there are things happening here. We see that some cities have been closing off their streets, turning streets into basically small parks. We've seen, of course, also that in some cases, parks were closed off. We should also see more attention on maybe redesigning parks specifically for health benefits, and trying to see, okay, what can we do to actually make our parks more health promoting? And of course, there are issues in terms of civil liberty and what we call green equity, because sometimes some people didn't have green space in their neighborhoods. And I'm sure you also know that from cities in the Philippines, that some of our more well-to-do areas in cities are usually greener. So it's easier for people to keep contact with green during these kind of lockdowns. So that brings me then to my field, which is the field of urban forestry. And Charles already gave me a really good introduction to this. This is really dealing with all the trees, all the forests, and all their associated vegetation in a city. And it's really actually integrating not only the ecological part of it, but also the socio-cultural part of the city, and to see it as one system. So you basically look at the city from the sky and you see it as one big forest-like area. And why is this important? It's important because we start working with a longer term perspective, with a more ecological way of looking at our cities. Urban forestry builds on a rich tradition. The part of the world where I've been most, Europe, there's a lot of literature on the history of trees, the history of forests in cities. City forests, for example, are pretty common phenomena. And of course, through the colonialization of other parts of the world, which is not at all a very positive effect, we see that some of these European traditions have been actually brought to other countries as well, including the Philippines. So some of the green structures that we see in cities like Manila, but also in places where I've worked, like in Malaysia and Kuala Lumpur, actually are very much based on this European approach to city greening. Of course, now we see trends in many tropical countries, for example, that there's a more locally sensitive approach to design of green spaces and design of cities, which of course is really good and really positive. Urban forests are nature-based solutions, and I will explain what those are, but really they help us solve all kinds of issues, all kinds of problems in our cities. And there's a lot of focus on the role of green and nature in cities these days, a lot of policies at the global level, the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, but also the UN's Decade of Restoration, which is currently ongoing. And one of the focus areas in that Decade of Restoration is actually on urban ecosystems. Then we see also here in Europe, there's all kinds of policies, for example, the European Green Deal, but then actually also at the local level, there's a lot happening. Cities like Melbourne and London, they've done a lot of work to promote greening their cities. And London has even actually proclaimed itself a national park city not so long ago. What are these nature-based solutions then? Well, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the term, but it's really about finding solutions to all these challenges that we're facing today in society in a way that is actually inspired by and especially supported by nature. And this is really not just about imitating nature, it's really about using nature, using trees, using, for example, green roofs to deal with things like climate change, to deal with things like ill health. And ideally, through nature-based solutions, we're also giving something back to nature. So we actually give nature a chance to thrive in our cities. Because, of course, often we have been over-designing and over-managing nature, which sometimes has maybe not resulted in all the kind of benefits that we could get from it. Sometimes nature-based solutions are also seen as including what we call biomimicry, to imitate natural forms, for example, in architecture. But there's a whole discourse on that here in Europe, where people say, well, no, we don't feel biomimicry is actually a nature-based solution. It should really involve nature itself. So trees, green roofs, rain gardens, yes, these are nature-based solutions, but just imitating nature in our architecture is not per se a nature-based solution. But there are different opinions on this, as mentioned. And in Europe, this is really a big thing now. The same in North America, and I know it's also coming to Asia quite intensively, trying to look at the things that ecosystems provide. And of course, we've spoken about ecosystem services for many years. So this is kind of the next step, nature-based solutions, using nature to address these challenges that we have in society. And in Europe, this is really a big thing. And that's all, of course, very nice, but how does urban forestry then fit in? And how do landscape architects, for example, contribute? Well, of course, one thing we do know from the research is that trees especially are really important in cities because they provide a whole range of benefits. Trees are really important, for example, for cooling. They're really important for public health promotion, for recreation, for biodiversity, and so on and so forth. So if we then want to bring more trees and more forest-like elements into cities, how do we do that? I'll take you to different types of urban forest that you can bring into the city, ranging from infill forest to actually imaginative or maybe even imaginary forests. Infilling you can do, of course, when you have an opportunity to change the land use towards greening. Well, until very recently, this was not very common because usually it was the other way around, right? We had a green space and then urbanization, densification took over the green space. And this is, of course, still the case in many places across the world. However, in places like China, for example, and this is a picture from Beijing, we see now that actually residential areas, industrial areas are transformed back into nature. And this could be for a stormwater park like this one. This could also be for example, tiny forest or pocket forests. So one of the things we've been doing in Vancouver, together with a PhD student called Haewon Park, who is originally from Korea, is to look at the potential of food forests and community gardens in developing green infrastructure and infilling with urban forests. And of course, food, as you all know, is a really important element of, for example, people interacting. And growing food in cities is really, really good to make that connection again between people, production, and nature. And of course, we just usually go to the supermarket and buy our food, but how wonderful it is to show our children how actually vegetables are grown, for example. And this is a big phenomenon now in places like Vancouver, where there's more and more food forest and community gardens being developed. And here we actually often draw experience and good practices from the tropical countries, where there, of course, is a much stronger tradition now with all kinds of home gardening and food forestry, etc. I already mentioned this idea of tiny forests, or sometimes we call this the Miyawaki method, after the Japanese inventor, where you really try to look at small areas that you have available and try to grow a kind of a pocket forest or miniature forest in these areas. And the idea is really to establish a diverse, multi-structured forest system that grows very quickly and closes its canopy very quickly, so you can start promoting the different benefits. And of course, again, especially in tropical countries, there's a lot of opportunity here because trees will grow very fast. But you see it also now happening in places like the UK and the Netherlands, where these kind of tiny forests are being established. Then sometimes we have to think about maybe reclaiming some of the land in cities or near cities and start growing forest on those. This is the city of Seoul in Korea. And here you see a former actually waste garbage dump area that has been transformed into a big forest-like park. And this was done for the World Cup football in 2002. And sometimes you actually use new land, as in Singapore, of course, where they have very little land available. So they reclaimed land from the sea here. And rather than just putting big apartment buildings on it, they actually used part of that land for making this wonderful green space called Gardens by the Bay. Some of you may be familiar with it. Very innovative way of combining forest, nature, and cities. And one of the really nice things is that this has become also a top destination, a tourist attraction for Singapore. And of course, in that way, it's starting to recuperate a lot of the investment that's being put into this. So actually, green space in cities, urban forest, can be good business. If you think about places like Central Park or the High Line in New York, they're actually generating a lot of income directly and indirectly, for example, from tourism. So sometimes you don't have the space to infill, you don't have the space to reclaim land and put green on it. So then you might have to think about vertical structures, right? To put forests on top of an elevated structure like an overpass, as here in Seoul again, in Korea. This is the Solo 7017 project. It used to be a very boring system of overpasses and walkways, but has now been turned in an arboretum, where you have different Korean trees being grown together. And of course, this softens this harsh urban landscape quite a bit. There are, of course, challenges here in terms of growing trees in very harsh urban conditions. And some of the trees are maybe not doing very well here. Well, iconic project High Line, of course, in New York. This railroad structure, where we see now that different types of vegetation, trees are being grown as well. High-profile project, as we all know. And of course, there's some criticism here, because actually some of the people that were living in this area, they were pushed away by the higher apartment prices, house prices, by development. So that is sometimes an issue when you green a city, when you bring in new green spaces. Actually, house prices go up and you start pushing out some of the original people living in the area. So how green is green enough? How can we green without maybe what we call gentrifying a neighborhood? This is another exciting development, of course, where we start putting trees and forests on buildings and on structures. This is Milano, a project by Stefano Boeri, an Italian landscape architect, or architect, I should say, the vertical forest, which is inspiring now similar projects in places like China as well. And architects, the sky is the limit sometimes when they think about the future, so they even start thinking about bringing vertical forests to Mars as soon as we get there. Recently we were there, of course, but not with people yet. So we'll see if this will ever happen. Then you can also transplant forest. And this is a really nice example from Tokyo, the Otamachi Tower project, where the city was actually not able really to do a lot, but it was the big companies here, the Hitachis and the Mitsubishis and other companies that are based in these big skyscrapers. And they felt they needed a good quality green space for their workers, so that these could actually have nice lunch breaks and maybe be inspired while being in a forest-like environment. So in this case, they grew a forest outside of the city of Tokyo. They let it establish itself for a few years, and then when the time was ready and there was a soil formation, there was a structure, they cut up this little forest in smaller pieces, and they put it on a train and brought it into the city and re-established it there on the site in the CBD of Tokyo. So of course, an expensive way of doing it, but I was there a few years ago. It really is a very nice feel to it. It's like a multi-layered forest in the middle of the city with a lot of wildlife, and really gives you that impression of being in a forest. It's very different than still from these wild forests, like here in North Vancouver, we call a temperate rainforest environment. This is a small area, but really natural and wild, with these big logs, a lot of biodiversity. So we used to take our kids here quite a bit, because for them, living in a city and still having this access to wild nature is actually very valuable. But of course, I mean, in urban society, there are some people who are afraid of wild nature. And I remember from my past work in Malaysia, that a lot of people said, well, we don't really want too wild forests because there's a lot of dangerous animals, there's a lot of mosquitoes. So you have to find a balance there between rewilding, bringing back nature, and also dealing with some of these disservices or nuisances that we face. So in China, the rewilding of green spaces has become a big issue, led by the president of China, President Xi, who is really eager to bring this kind of forest experience into the cities. So this is a small park near Tiananmen Square in Beijing, where actually a traditional park has been transformed into a miniature forest park with a lot of different tree species, a lot of structure, integration of art. And of course, in China, these things are done very rapidly. So this park was established within a couple of years. And I was working there with a group of students, landscape architecture students from Beijing Forestry University, just 2 summers ago, where we actually tried to look at this design and try to think, okay, how can we turn this into a more ecologically sound park? And how can we manage this in a better way in the next years? Because you can get an instant effect, of course, but we saw also quite a few of the new trees, big trees, were dying. So there are, of course, challenges with this kind of, you can almost call it instant forest that we see emerge in different places. And then sometimes we have to also realize that everybody, all of us, we have our own mindset of what the forest is. And we have our own perception, maybe after the experiences we had as children, or the books we've read, or the movies we've seen, the computer games we play, of what a forest is like. So you see here this nice picture on the right. This is from a forest in Surrey, south of Vancouver, where children felt that this forest is like a fairy tale forest, an elf forest. So they started bringing little houses for the elves. And this actually turned a little bit crazy, because now there are thousands of small houses for the elves. And some people there feel, of course, this is too much, right? This is almost like a Disneyfication of the forest. And we know, of course, sense of smell is really important in our experience of nature. So this is from the city of Amsterdam, from my home country of the Netherlands, where I found in a museum shop this kind of perfume, male perfume or a cologne. It's called the Water of Amsterdam. And if you can see it there, it says the scent of elm trees. So, of course, like many cities in the world, Amsterdam has had Dutch elm disease, has lost a lot of its elm trees. So the smell of the elms, especially, for example, after a rainy day, was very particular. And by packaging this, there's some kind of nostalgic connection to the time when there were a lot of elm trees in the city. So we of course, experience urban forests with all of our senses. And of course, in some of the more science fiction approaches to trees and forests, the picture is not very positive. This is the movie Blade Runner 2049. Some of you might have seen it, where there is actually a tree as an important character, I would say, in the movie, but unfortunately is a dead tree. So let's hope that through our work, we can do better than this by the year 2049. Then a little maybe sidestep here. When I start talking about nature-based thinking in cities, one really important aspect of it, of course, is to give nature its own, we call, agency, to recognize that it's not only about us human beings, nature serving us, it's also about us doing something for nature, right? To actually understand that we are part of nature as well. Some of you may have heard this story about a monkey in Indonesia on the island of Sulawesi that took a picture, a selfie of itself. It was a photographer, professional photographer called David Slater. He was setting up all his gear in the forest to take pictures. And then he had to step away. And then this monkey stepped up and took a few pictures of himself. So it became an interesting case because some animal rights activists started taking this case to court and say, well, hey, actually, it was not the photographer who took the picture, it was the monkey. So the monkey should have the rights to this picture. They lost the case, so the photographer was allowed to use the photos as if he took them. But it shows a little bit this interesting discussion that we see more and more now about the legal rights of nature, of treating nature, natural elements, as a person in a legal sense. And this is based on some of the earlier work by people like Christopher Stone, who wrote about that in his book, Should Trees Have Standing? So should we recognize in our legal proceedings the rights of nature, of trees, of animals? Or as here in the case of Quebec, as you see here on the right, there was a river in Quebec that has been granted legal rights as part of a global personhood movement. And this is a trend in general that we start giving more recognition to nature, and especially natural elements. So back in the days when I started doing urban forestry in the Netherlands, I did a lot of work on the history of urban woodlands in Europe. And it turned out there were a lot of these kind of conflict cases, as here in Vienna in Austria, where there was a trend to maybe convert the forest, to exploit it, to cut the trees. But then there were always people standing up in society that said, hey, no, we have to stop, right? This is a really valuable resource. We have to protect this for biodiversity, for recreation. And if we cut the forest, we will lose all these different benefits. And we see still these cases happening. This is from my home country, the Netherlands, where we had in the 1980s a big conflict over a small forest near a town called Utrecht. There was a highway to be constructed and the forest would have to be cut, but people actually stopped it. And now again, so many years later, politicians come with a very similar idea, and you see again people coming out and protesting and say, hey, we have to really keep this forest because it is so important for us. So bringing that in then, this idea of trying to bring the forest back into the city, to retrofit, to create forest cities, but also to see in that a central role for nature itself, we could develop this kind of nature-based thinking approach. And this is based on a paper I wrote together with a few colleagues last year on nature-based thinking, which really basically takes that nature-based solutions idea and broadens it and says, well, it's not only about nature doing things for us, it's also about us doing things for nature. And if we use nature as a frame for developing livable, high-quality cities, then we're actually going to get a lot of good benefits. But that means that we have to let nature free sometimes, let it do some of its own work to recognize that nature has its cycles and has its ecological functioning. And that means also that sometimes we cannot over-design or over-manage it, but we have to work with nature rather than working against it. And I realize in places like the Philippines and Manila, of course, nature can grow, it develops very fast. So you will have to, in some ways, control it in the middle of the cities, rather not to be overgrown by it. But still, in some places, you can probably work and let it be more free as well, and use ecological processes to a greater extent. So when we do that, we, of course, try to link these different dimensions of the local community, the people that we serve as urban foresters and landscape designers, but, of course, also the forest itself, right, the different green spaces, and then also the kind of the structure of its planning, its management. And these three components together really work towards creating greener, better, and healthier cities. And if we do this properly and recognize there is different actors, different stakeholders, then it's my true belief that we can actually develop much better cities and much better urban forests to go with them. But that requires that we bring in the best possible research on what nature does and how nature works. So one of my colleagues at UBC, Professor Suzanne Simard, she came with this very famous research that trees are communicating, and they do that underground in the soil. So through their root systems, the mycorrhizal system, there's actually an exchange of nutrients, of warning signals, of information. So when a tree perceives there's, for example, a pest or a disease approaching, then the tree would warn the other trees, and not only its own species, but actually other species as well. So it turns out actually this forest system is much more complex than we have thought so far. It's not just about trees competing for nutrients and light, but it's also about trees collaborating. And if you would humanify it a little bit, you can say that trees actually are social beings. So they need to be together with other trees in order to thrive. So this is important knowledge also for urban forestry, because we typically put trees in rather isolated spots, in boxes. We use maybe one tree species of the same clonal material, the same gene material along our streets. And that may not be the best way of thinking ecologically about creating urban forests. Of course, also in cities, it may be difficult to have old trees because along streets, and so we are afraid of health issues or of hazards and other problems. But we have to, wherever we can, try to let the trees grow old as well, because we know that they then start providing all these different benefits in a greater extent. For example, biodiversity, carbon sequestration, etc. In a futuristic perspective, this nature-based thinking approach can look like this. These kind of forest city approach that the Chinese have been developing together with, again, people like Stefano Boeri. And I'm really a big fan of the work of a landscape architect that many of you will know, Kang-Yan Yu, who runs Tourandscape, one of the biggest landscape architecture firms in the world, I would say. And he really has brought in that idea of working with nature and creating what he calls sponge cities. So green cities, blue cities that can actually deal with things like massive rains and deal with floods, etc. And using green, but also actually using very strong cultural elements and art to create these really beautiful green spaces that are also very functional. And if we do that, if we work in that way, we also definitely have to think about things like what I call, or what colleagues of mine have coined, biocultural diversity. So we're not just looking at biodiversity, at all the diversity of the life in the city, but actually we integrate the cultural diversity component to that. So actually these two are not separate, because people are shaping nature or helping to shape nature in cities and creating this really intricate system of green spaces and nature. So we should really integrate those two when we work with communities and work with nature in cities. And of course, also we have to realize that nature in cities is somewhat different. So this is some work we did led by a PhD student called Zhejiu Hao from Beijing, who was looking at soundscapes in cities, and especially at birds, and how birds' song is changing in urban areas because of, for example, the human noise, the human disturbance, but also the vegetation structure. And actually birds start adapting their song, for example, the pitch or the level of their singing according to these noise levels and according to the urban setting. So of course, by urbanizing, we're creating adaptations also in the nature around us. All right, let me move then to the final part of my talk, and at the end I'll be very happy to take your questions as well, to explain some of this a little bit further. But of course, when I talk, as I do a lot with decision makers and planners and managers of green spaces, then they often ask me, so what do we do and how do we do this? Can you give me some really easy ways to start implementing all these great ideas? Well, I sometimes talk about the 12 C's, something about connecting. So it's about connecting between different types of green space, but it's also about connecting people and green. It's about collaboration, right? It's about bringing multiple disciplines, multiple actors together to create urban forests. It's about community. So it means very much we're working, of course, for the local community and try to understand what they want from their urban forest. It's about communication. I think urban foresters need to be good communicators because there's so many interests, there's so many potential conflicts. So we have to really be good in explaining, but also understanding what people want. We need clarity, so we need some really good targets, some good visions that can drive long-term urban forestry programs. And that has to be done, of course, by competent, well-trained professionals, including well-trained landscape architects that play a really important role in all of this. We need to be creative. We need to think out of the box and come with some really nice solutions. And I've shown you some of those, like the Otamachi Tower project in Tokyo. We need to be courageous. Sometimes we have to really take courageous steps. And our politicians will be asked to do so as well, to say, hey, we're not making an extra highway. We're not going to build an extra superstore. We're actually going to prioritize nature here because we know we need it on the longer term. So there we need also champions. We need leaders, community leaders. That could be politicians. That could also be, for example, music stars or sport heroes that actually want to help us promote tree planting, tree management, and drive these programs forward. Of course, that requires also funding. We need resources. You cannot do urban forestry for free, right? There's always a need for an allocation of enough funding. And we know that many cities in the world don't really spend a lot of money on their green infrastructure. They spend a lot of money, though, on public health. They spend a lot of money on, for example, economic development. So maybe there are ways, and there are ways, to connect these things much better and to make sure that some of the public health funding actually comes into the urban forestry system as well, because we do a lot in preventing ill health. But of course, then context and the complexity of local situation is really crucial. So I've never had the pleasure yet to work in the Philippines, but if I would do that, I would be very hesitant to tell what to do, obviously, because I have to first understand your local context, the specificity of the way you work. So I would always work together, of course, with local experts to understand like what is really happening here, what is the urban forest, and how does it interact with local people. Just to highlight some of these C's, of course, this is actually a very nice illustration, I think, from a paper by Townsend and Barton that shows over our history as human beings how we have had the trees close to us. And although we might have left them a little bit, we're still keeping them also in our cities. So we are very closely associated with trees as our fellow beings, as humans. We've seen this collaborative approach emerging in terms of new models for managing urban forests, developing urban forests, as here in London, for the London Park City, but also other cities like Toronto in Canada or Stockholm in Sweden and some Finnish cities. They've started creating national parks within the boundaries of the city. And it really starts challenging the whole idea we have maybe of national parks as areas that are untouched. These are areas where nature and culture, and even economy in some cases, they go hand in hand. And it's a really interesting concept, I think, for improving our cities. Of course, collaboration also relates to working with the community and to stewardship. And you're, of course, familiar with the term stewardship. It's really about conducting, supervising, managing, taking care of the land, not only for ourselves, but realizing actually we're passing this on to the next generations. And when I worked in Canada, I was really impressed by the work done by First Nations, the indigenous populations in Vancouver, for example, or in British Columbia, who have this very strong connection to the local nature and to the local land. Communication, as said, is key. Of course, some people are really good in communicating. Somebody like Harina Nagendra in India, she has done some really nice work on communicating the values of trees in Indian cities. For example, in this really nice little book called The Cities and Canopies. But it could also be a novel. This is a novel by Richard Powers here on the left that won a lot of prizes in the US. It's called The Overstory. And it's really about how people and forests, how people and trees are intertwined in their personal histories. So if you're interested in reading and you want to read some good books, these are really two good recommendations, especially for those of us who are interested in nature and in trees. So we're doing some really interesting work at UBC as well in trying to bring smart technologies or information technologies into the management of our green spaces. So we have not always been so high tech, I think, at least not in green space management. So there's definitely opportunities here to use things like drones, wireless internet, sensors, to try to understand much better in a kind of on a real-time basis, how the urban forest is doing. And then we can feed that information into our planning and management approaches, which is really a good way forward. So this is a PhD student called Sophie Nitaslavsky, who's doing some really interesting work. If you just Google smart urban forestry or Internet of Nature, you'll find some really nice work done by Sophie, but also by another colleague called Nadine Galle, a Dutch lady who's doing a lot of really nice work on this. And then I've done a little bit of work myself in trying to come up with some clarity, right? Some clear guidance. So this is a new rule that I try to implement or try to promote. This is the 30-300 rule for urban forestry. And it basically says that we have to bring trees and green spaces all the way into people's neighborhoods and actually all the way onto people's doorsteps. So in order to promote people's health and well-being and to adapt cities to climate change, we have to, for example, have 30% canopy cover in each neighborhood. Because we know from research, if you go under 30%, there's a lot of negative aspects in terms of people's health, in terms of cooling. Of course, more than 30% would be great as well, but 30% is a really good cutoff point. You see famous cities like Barcelona and Seattle, Canberra, Vancouver, they've all set that target of 30% canopy within the next maybe 20 or 30 years. We also want to make sure that people have good access to local green spaces, where maybe within 300 meters walk, which is like a 5, maybe 10 minutes walk, people can come to an area, and it doesn't have to be a big area. It could be maybe 0.5 hectares or so, where they can do different types of activities. They could be just interacting with their friends, sitting around. There could be children playing. There could be some form of exercise even. Could also be experiencing nature. So 300 meters to the nearest public space, a green space. And that could be, as I said, a park, a pocket park, or a larger park. It could also be a green avenue where there's enough space for people to also enjoy nature. And then finally, we know from recent research that the visual access to green space, so the green you can see from your window, from your apartment, from your home, is actually really important. So the 3 in this formula says that we should see at least 3 different trees or 3 trees from our windows. And if we do so, we will get very important mental health benefits. And of course, we have experienced this a lot during the COVID lockdowns. So the pictures here in the bottom, you see actually how it looks for me. So if I look behind me in the window outside, I see at least 3 trees. I see a few more. I have a pretty decent canopy in my neighborhood, although it's a very urban part of Barcelona. And if I walk about 300 meters, I get to this nice green avenue that they have completely transformed into doubling as a park with all kinds of natural elements, with stormwater functions, and also, of course, with very nice opportunities to interact with other people. So just to show you how that looks then, so this is some work done by Humankind, an organization based in the Netherlands. So they have done what they call a greenness score for each street in a number of Dutch cities. And here you see the Groningen example. Groningen is a city in the Netherlands in the north, where you see how the level of greenness can differ between different streets. So you can actually start assessing where maybe the greenness is not enough. And if you don't have enough visual access to green, then you could have negative mental health issues. We've also done some work, and this is Cobra, a company in the Netherlands. They've been looking for me at the 30% rule, and to looking at different cities in the Netherlands and to see who actually has 30% canopy cover. And as you will see here, not many cities have. A lot of cities are far below 30% in different neighborhoods. There are a few cities there in the center of the country, here in the Utrecht area, where you see where actually the 30% is being met. And there is definitely opportunity. There are definitely ways of getting to 30%. And then finally, this is some work that shows this 300 meters to the nearest park aspect. This is work done by Mathilde van den Bos and colleagues actually on an assignment of the World Health Organization. And you see, for example, if you look at a green space area that is maybe 1 hectare in size, then in many cities, this is the cities of Malmö, Kaunas, and Utrecht, all in European countries, you see that actually in most cities, more than 70% of the population already has access within 300 meters to a green space of that size. So there are opportunities, and of course I realize it will be different wherever you are in the world, but this is really an important way, I think, of bringing forward the benefits of urban forests and green spaces. So competence I mentioned as well is one of my 12 C's. This really relates also very strongly, of course, to educating good landscape architects, good urban foresters. And what we do at UBC is that we have an urban forestry undergrad program, which now has about 280 students from all over the world. Actually, a lot of Chinese students these days. But then we also have now this new master program where we want people who have maybe some more experience, who have worked already in cities, also people from different backgrounds. It could be landscape architecture, it could be planning, to come and take about 1 year professional masters at UBC. And we're starting this summer with the first cohort of students. And this is a fully online program with some interactive elements as well, because of course you need to be able to talk about leadership and not just to learn about it. So how does it look then? Well, this is hopefully an image that we'll see in many places. This is Vancouver, looking from the south towards downtown and towards the North Coast mountains. And if you take the picture in the right way in Vancouver, the city really looks like a forest, as you see here. So really important canopy for the city. But of course, Situation will be very different if I go to a place like Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, where I've done a little bit of work as well, where the canopy cover is less than 1% right now. And of course, Riyadh is a city that faces tremendous challenges in terms of heating. Sometimes summer temperatures are passing 50 degrees centigrade or even more. So it's very difficult for people to be outside. But still, a lot of the trees that are there are palm trees. And as you know, palm trees are not really good for cooling. So we have to start changing people's minds and start changing policies, as they're doing in Riyadh, where they invest a lot of money now in greening the city and bringing the canopy cover up to what they say maybe 10% even. So that means, of course, that we really have to understand the local situation. And we did a bit of work where we tried to see how cities across the world are different in terms of, first of all, of course, the level of urbanization. It could be from slow to fast, the pace of urbanization. Also the level of sprawl. Is it a really dense city or is it a very sprawled out city? And then finally, of course, it's very different for a city that's affluent, that has the means and the planning tools and the money to control, or some cities that don't have it. And then you can actually start putting those cities in this kind of triangular structure and to see what their specific context is. So I've talked quite a bit now, and I think my time is getting close to the end. So just to reiterate some of the points that I mentioned. So I think we're living in really exciting times, challenging times, but also exciting times. And I think for those of us in our fields, landscape architecture, urban forestry, urban ecology, and other related fields, these are really good times because we are really needed. We need good professionals who can help cities be greener, be more sustainable, be more climate adapted, be healthier. And when we do that, of course, we have to deal or work with concepts that translate, right, that are easily understood also by communities, by politicians, by business, things like nature-based solutions, but also nature-based thinking. And we have to recognize there, of course, that nature also has a role of its own. It's not only about us molding and shaping nature, it's also about recognizing that we are nature. And like nature, there's a lot of processes going on that cannot always be fully controlled. So if we work with that, and we work also with concepts like bioculture, diversity, and stewardship, and of course place, which is a very strong concept in landscape architecture, I think there is a really good opportunity to do a better job in greening our cities wherever we are in the world. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm very happy to take some questions.
Hi, yes. Thank you for that very insightful talk, Dr. Cecil. Now we will go on with the question and answer. But right now, me and Professor Donna will alternate in giving you the question. So the first question would be that what are the expertise or the professionals that you typically work with in creating urban forest?
Great, thank you, Joyce. That's a great question. So we need definitely different professionals. So I would say the people I work most with is landscape architects, landscape designers, and I work mostly with some people that have some kind of forestry or ecology backgrounds. So these are the two main groups. But then I actually work a lot with planners. I work a lot with more and more actually with economic experts. I work a lot actually with artists. So you see there's a more wider approach. Public health professionals is another group. So I've done quite a bit of work now working with people that are interested in promoting better health and well-being. So I think that's the key thing with urban forestry, is that we actually need all these different professionals. But I've seen in the past, the main groups really for me are landscape architecture and some kind of forestry green space management group as well. So these are the kind of the driving groups, I think, for this field.
Thank you, Dr. Cecil. From our Zoom chat, we have a question from Mr. Arolfo. How can we manage an urban forest if it is covered by several boundaries by several local governments with varied purposes of managing the area?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And we know some examples. I worked with a few examples also here in Europe where we have forests that are between different governments. There could be local governments, sometimes even regional governments. So one really important thing is to find a way to develop a common vision for the area. So if all the different stakeholders can agree on a vision and then develop a strategy, then it's actually doable to work across authorities and across administrative boundaries. But it's very difficult if you cannot develop that kind of vision, right? If there's conflicts about what people want, then it may be very difficult. But I've seen really good examples of how actors, stakeholders are coming together around a vision, realizing that they have a lot of common interest. And then, of course, the next question is who is doing what, etc. But usually that can be solved if there is a strong common vision.
Yes. Next question would be, how do you manage the wild animals that are attracted to this urban forest? For example, here in the Philippines, in our university, there are owls where that are approached by people. And for example, in Korea, I know there are deers and moose in Norway.
Yeah, that's a great question as well. Sometimes people like it, right? Sometimes, like children, they like to see animals. But sometimes animals can also be a real nuisance. So when we were in Vancouver, we had raccoons that came into our garbage bins, for example, and opened them. And sometimes I would open the bin and then all of a sudden there was a raccoon in it. And they could be pretty aggressive. We had coyotes, which is this kind of wolves walking in the parks and sometimes being a bit aggressive as well. We had even mountain lions, right? Cougars that were coming into the city sometimes from the mountains. So of course we have to find a way of managing these issues. And it's sometimes about public awareness. For example, not letting people feed animals. As you already said, Joyce, it is really one issue sometimes. It's also about awareness that we have to live with the animals and let them be wild, right? So in Vancouver, the principle is that people or animals are welcome and we co-live with animals. So unless there's some really big issue, the animals are allowed to live in the city. But I realize in some countries, this could be an issue with poisonous animals, diseases, right, with insects, etc. So we have to manage this issue, I think. But on the other hand, it's also really good for us to live together with animals, especially also for our children, and to have respect for nature, I think.
For our next Zoom question from Ms. Levy Espinas, is it possible to integrate urban forest corridor into the 20-minute neighborhood?
Thank you, Levi, for that question. That's really good and a good question, because as you know, there's a lot of focus on these 20-minute neighborhoods now. And I think it has really happened also with the COVID pandemic that we all say, well, we need to be able to have these neighborhood where everything is included within 20 minutes. And I think that includes also green space and urban forest. So for me, that's a basic infrastructure like shops and schools and public transport. We need to also have green spaces. So definitely, and I think there the 300-meter rule is an important part, right? If we don't want to move more than 5 or 10 minutes to reach a small park, for example, where we can be with our friends and family, we can maybe play some sports and also enjoy nature. So definitely this should be part of it.
Hi, yes, next question from Zoom, coming from Raphael. In general, what do you think is the biggest hindrance to implementing an effective urban forestry project?
That's also a very good question. I think one big hindrance could be a lack of awareness and lack of support from, for example, the political system. So if there's not enough support, official support, it could sometimes be very difficult. On the other hand, I've seen examples where local community groups have been really good in still realizing things and putting pressure on the decision makers to implement urban forestry. So I think if I stay away from that, I would say the two main factors are lack of resources, and resources can be money, but it could also be time, right? But it actually can also be lack of knowledge. So sometimes we don't have the particular knowledge. So lack of resources is really a big hindrance. And then the second one, I think, is maybe a long-term perspective, right? Sometimes it's really difficult for people to look beyond the next year or the next 2 years because there's all these issues we have to deal with. So you need to have some kind of strategic idea that you can then bring in your knowledge and your expertise and your funding and develop for a common interest. So there are plenty of barriers, of course, but lack of knowledge, lack of resources, lack of vision, I think are really key. And then lack of support from the officials is another one.
Thank you, Dr. Cecil. So another question from Zoom. May I ask if the concept of biodiversity of trees and plants is much more preferable in urban forest design compared to the use of few species of trees and shrubs?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, definitely. This is a really good point, right? So we need biodiversity. We need species diversity for different reasons. So one is, of course, climate change. We know that if we only have very few species, we're going to lose them, probably because of climate change. And it could be directly because of drought, but it could also be indirectly because we'll get more pests and diseases. So we've seen that in many cities in North America and Europe, that we have lost a lot of tree species, a lot of trees, because of these pests and diseases, like Dutch elm disease, or emerald ash borer, or Asian longhorn beetle. And because we've been planting so few species often, sometimes maybe 40 or 50% the same species, then when one pest comes that likes that species, it's very easy. You can just go through the city and eat up all the trees. So we have to diversify. And of course, diversity is also important for biodiversity in general. It's important for recreation, for health. We know that biodiversity can promote our mental health. And so there are many different reasons why really we should have biodiversity. It's basically building in an insurance mechanism in our urban forest that if something happens in terms of climate change or threats of pests and diseases, that we're not dependent on only a few species. And of course, in the Philippines, for example, you have so many species. So you actually have good opportunities to mix different tree and shrub species.
Thank you. So next question, it is related to the previous one. From Al, should existing exotic tree species be replaced by indigenous species or just let it stand and later be covered by the native species?
That's another really good question. It's maybe one of the hot topics. Should we just use native species or should we be allowed to use exotic species? Of course, first of all, if you have trees right now, I would not start removing all the exotic trees because some of them have really strong values in the community, for example. People really appreciate them. So then it's better to maybe have a gradual approach where you start replacing over time these exotic species. We also know that in many cities, we need also, and this is maybe less a case for you, but it's definitely a case for us in Europe, we need exotic species because we need species that are adapted to city environments. And urban environments are very different from the surrounding environments. They're very dry, they're very harsh. So in some countries, for example, in the Scandinavian countries, you have to use a different range of species, including exotic species. So I'm personally a big fan of using native species where relevant and where we can, but then we should also supplement that where relevant with exotic species, also in this kind of adaptation to climate change. So the short answer to the question, I would do gradually, maybe a transition, if people prefer to start using more native trees and native plants.
So another question, given the pandemic, how can we encourage cities or local chief executives to adopt or prioritize sustainable landscape techniques that allow nature parks and green spaces to thrive? From RGN.
Yeah, very, very important one as well. I really hope that people understand during the pandemic or after the pandemic when we get through this, how important our local nature is. So I definitely have seen signs of it, for example, here in Barcelona, where local politicians have started closing off streets, establishing more public spaces, because they realize we really need this. So there is momentum, right? There's political attention. There's a lot of research that shows how important green space has been for us. Increased use, for example, especially for women, we've seen that many countries have seen that women were especially appreciative of local parks and green spaces because they had a lot of responsibilities during the pandemic, taking care of the family, very stressful, more stressful than before because kids were home as well. So they really needed that escape to go out. So I think if we use that research and we highlight really the importance of local green space, then we should also hold our politicians, our decision makers accountable and make sure that they don't forget this. But they really have to keep pushing these strategies. They have to fund properly as well green and sustainable cities.
Okay, next question would be from Omar. Have you worked on green fingers, ridge to coast green corridors that serve as wildlife access to a continuum of habitats? Do you recommend it for coastal cities in the Philippines?
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting approach. And the one city where green fingers was really a big thing was Copenhagen in Denmark, where I lived for about 10 years. So in the 1940s, the city developed what they call the Green Finger Plan, with green fingers coming in from all sides into the city. And it really helped by promoting these corridors and connecting with the surrounding countryside. but it also really meant that people always had good access to green space because you were never far away from a green finger. So I think it's an interesting approach. I know, in general, I like these kind of approaches that think at the city level and try to bring in green spaces into the city. I don't know the Philippine coastal cities well enough, but I would expect that this is actually an approach that could work in many cities. It's often easier than to start making a big new green infrastructure inside the city. It's better to start making corridors along maybe waterways, rivers, or roads, and to start making these into green fingers.
This one is quite personal. So, what inspires you to dedicate your career and lifelong research in urban forestry?
Oh, that's a nice question. Yeah. I think it's a passion for nature, right? It's really, since I was a young child, my parents took me to the forest in the Netherlands, and I really loved nature. And I started realizing I wanted to work with nature, but then also really like people. I like working with people, I like working with people from all over the world. And I see that combination of bringing nature and people together in cities as really as my life's passion. It's also very interesting because you actually can work with social sciences, with design, with natural sciences. So you always have to bridge boundaries. And for me personally, I need to be challenged. So I need to have challenges in my life, in my work. So I always have to experience some new opportunities and new challenges in my work. So I think actually urban forestry turned out to be the perfect career for me because I can fulfill all the different parts of my passion and then actually also make a living out of it, which is a nice additional thing. So my hobby, really, my passion has become my work.
Yes, next question would be, what is the general strategy or approach in implementing urban forestry in dense urban areas? There is this impression that an urban forest is always associated with the need for big space allocation.
Yeah, great question. Because of course, as we know, many of our cities are very dense, and I'm sure that's the same also in the Philippines. So then we really have to think about, well, first of all, what is the space that is available? And also, what techniques do we have actually on a small space to still create the impression of a forest? So then this Miyawaki method, this kind of tiny forest approach, but also creating biodiverse small pocket parks can actually really help us. Of course, we have to look at the buildings as well, things like green roofs and using people's balconies. We have to think about being very creative in bringing nature into the city. And we have to move away maybe from the idea that an urban forest is always a very large space. It can be a very small area, right? It could even be just a couple of trees together that still create a really interesting place for people to sit, to meet up, a neighborhood gathering place. So sometimes even a single tree can really make a huge difference.
Okay. So here's another question. What are the issues and challenges you encounter in managing urban forests? For example, tree roots in order not to destroy roads and walkway pavements.
Yeah, that's another great question. So of course we know that the biggest problem for trees in cities is lack of space. So it's not so much about lack of water, it's not about lack of nutrients, it's really the space which is the problem. And the space is especially the underground space. So when I teach my students in Vancouver, I always tell them the number one thing you have to know, a tree needs enough soil volume. So it needs a certain amount of soil where it can grow its roots. So as the question says, of course, we're often dealing with underground infrastructure, with drainage, sometimes with electricity underground. So we have to find much better ways of integrating our infrastructure with consideration of trees. We see that now in some cities that they're trying to combine the infrastructure and to create enough space for the trees, for example, through soil cells or similar structures. And here, I think, again, the landscape architects, the designers have a really important role to play to optimize also the underground availability of space for trees.
For our last question, Dr. Cecil, so there is from PIEP, from Environmental Planners Association from Cebu, from one of our cities in the Philippines. What would you recommend in cities where what remains as forest are only coastal vegetation, for example, mangrove or beach forest?
That's a very good question. I think, and I've seen some examples of that actually these wetland mangrove type green spaces can be very important or are very important. They provide many different benefits. And I've seen some nice examples from Australian cities like Brisbane, where they've made better access to some of those mangrove forests by creating, for example, walkways or boardwalks, so people could still interact with them. And so they started working really, or functioning as parks, as public parks. So, but we know, of course, I mean, the main roles of wetlands relate to biodiversity, they relate to water control, but I think there can be creative ways of maybe using those mangrove forests and wetlands as part of your green infrastructure. And I think that has to do again with local context. In a place like Cebu, probably it's more appropriate to work with these kind of ecosystems. And then to see if you can maybe integrate those systems even further inside the city, for example, along waterways.
Okay, so here's another question. The 330-300 rule for promoting health and well-being through urban forests seems to be a nice idea. However, is there a significant basis for this, or it is just an arbitrary ratio?
Yes, thank you. Of course, it might sound a bit arbitrary, but it's actually, I would say, it's really research-based. So the 30% canopy is really based on the latest research, for example, from Australia, that says that 30% is a critical cutoff in terms of people's health and also in terms of cooling. So work in North America has shown that cities should really strive for 40%. 30% is kind of okay in terms of cooling neighborhoods. The 300 meters is also very well documented. We know that if people have to walk more than 300, maybe 500 meters, then they don't use the local park as much. The 3 trees is the more arbitrary element in it. So, and that has to do really with, excuse me, with creating enough visible access to green. And this is really the latest research that shows that the main effect we get from green is from the daily interaction, just looking at it from our window, right? We just sit and work, we look outside and we see a tree, and that actually gives us stress relief, it gives us creativity. So then the idea is, of course, how you do that. Well, when 3 trees could be one nice way. If you have a tree in your garden or you have a few trees in your street, you actually have that access and you have enough green around you to get that effect. So partly arbitrary, but I would say still evidence-based, this rule. And the feedback I've gotten so far from people across the world is that it's ambitious, but they can really see the benefit of having clear guidance for decision makers and for planners.
Okay, we have one more question. Is it okay?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
There's so many questions. So how much distance would you recommend for landscapes with trees along sides or aisles of roads?
That's a very good question. And again, that depends a little bit. So there's research going on that says maybe we should put trees closer together, maybe not on maybe 4 meters or even more that we see in many places, but even closer. I think it's difficult to say. I think it depends also a little bit on the type of trees. Obviously, it depends on the type of space. A place like Singapore is experimenting with almost like forest-like corridors. So they create different layers of trees, shrub layers, so you get the impression of a forest along the street. So it's a difficult question. So it depends a little bit, but I would definitely look at your soil volume and make sure, okay, if I look at the tree when it's mature, what soil volume will the root system have to cover? And if I know that, then I can start trying to pace out my street trees. I would not put them too far away from each other either, because you then don't get that interaction, you don't get that system working. Actually, trees help protect each other.
So, yes, Joyce.
Hi, yes, so I think that's our last question. Now we have Professor Vic Duloob to wrap up the webinar.
Thank you.
Yes, good evening, everyone. We would like to thank Dr. Cecil for this very informative evening or afternoon, no? And to wrap up the webinar, I would just like to point some uh, major issues that he tackled. No, he made mention on the role of green spaces in urban forestry, that it is more now relevant due to the pandemic, and that landscape architects now play a very major role in designing these open spaces. And landscape architects, or the design professions that is involved in open spaces should capitalize on the current times. Okay, so we must reintroduce the appreciation of nature. No, we should uh, we should try to apply the 330 and 300 rule, and size doesn't matter actually. It may be a small parks, or it can be hectares of park, and we need to mainstream urban nature. And with this, good governance should also be taken into consideration, and the challenges of border restrictions or boundaries, political boundaries, uh, should also be looked into. But we all know that there's no political boundary when we talk about nature. And we need to expand urban forests in the post-COVID times. And by doing this, we need to relay the importance of this urban forest to our policymakers. In the Philippines, you need to monetize. We say you need to monetize the value of a certain ecosystem. For example, a single mature tree, for the common people here, they see the single tree as just lumber. No, that's the ecosystem services that is uh, the value of the tree for them. But a single tree can give an ecosystem services as much as 5 million pesos. So as long as we don't monetize, or we don't relay the value of a single tree to our policymakers, no, we will continue to experience the loss of urban forest or urban greenery. He also talked on the maintenance issues of this urban greening or urban forest, and there are issues on insects and animals. But since this is nature, we should learn to appreciate them also. And lack of space, which usually the main issue for urban forests, no, especially on the maintenance issue of root systems with the industry. So when we try to design spaces in urban areas, we should always take into consideration the size of these trees that we are going to use, or we are going to specify. There are some concepts that was also discussed, like the forest city concepts, where in the green blue infrastructure is one of the emerging trends. Uh, with this green blue infrastructure concept also comes the biocultural diversity, wherein people and nature are not separate basically, no. So they should be working, or they should be living in a hand in hand. Okay. And uh, going back to the maintenance issue also, I think if you look at the discussions of the 12 Cs that Dr. Cecil mentioned about, the issues on maintenance can be covered on this one. Okay. In terms of the question and answer portion, there were a lot of questions that were discussed, and most of these includes the role of professionals, the role of stakeholders, especially policymakers, and there was this one discussion that struck me in terms of biodiversity. What if you have existing exotic trees? Are we going to uproot them or cut them down and replace them with native trees? Because we are faced with the dilemma, not only in some areas in the Philippines, but one good example would be our campus, wherein we have a lot of exotic species, but they are really thriving now in the campus, and they give a sense of place of the campus. And we face that dilemma, if are we going to cut them down and replace them with native trees? And I think it was answered Okay, so thank you very much. And I think that's all. And thank you again, Dr. Cecil, for having us tonight. And thank you, everyone who joined us for this webinar.
All right.
Char?
Thanks everybody for joining. Very nice to see
Yeah.
you. Good luck.
I think we need to have a group picture.
Group picture, yeah.
Okay, before we do that, let me remind all the participants to answer our feedback form after this webinar. The link is already given below. So kindly check and to receive your certificate of attendance. Thank you, Dr. Cecil, and to everyone who participated. So who will take the picture? Sir Vic, can you do the honors?
Yeah, sure.
Please turn on your video so we can
yes.
see you personally.
And you need to smile for a bit because we have a lot of participants here. Okay.
We have 66 here.
Yes.
Ready?
Yeah, I got the first page. Now for the next page. Okay, it's done. Char, back to you, Char. Is Char still here?
Hello, yeah, I'm still here. Well, the rest of the participants may now leave the meeting and we could stop the recording already and the YouTube live. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.